Welcome, Brian Tokar, hails from Worcester, Vermont, and heads the Institute of Social Ecology. And I'm Laura from Transition Town Jericho. Welcome, everyone. So glad you're here. This will be a roughly 40-minute presentation.
More or less.
Yeah, more or less. Then we'll have questions and answers, some refreshment. Really like for our audience to mingle, get to know each other. But we'll make sure if you have a question after, I'm going to be passing this around so that you get on. We are filming this. By the way, thank you, MMU TV Public Access. Very happy they're here because people call, they want to hear this, and they can access the video. So very important that we tape it. Thank you, Brian. Take it.
Well, thank you, Laura. And as Laura said, I'm Brian Tokar. I've been living in central Vermont pretty much since the mid-1980s. And for most of that time, I've been involved with an organization called the Institute for Social Ecology, which had actually been around for close to 10 years before that. We actually celebrated our 50th anniversary last summer, not this past summer, but the summer before. And we're still going strong, and I can say more about what we're doing. We have online classes and but what I'm going to do this evening is give you an overview of the worldview of social ecology and how it might help illuminate some of the problems that we're facing right now. Maybe my hands will be freer if I stand here. So I'm sure everybody realizes that this is a challenging time for imagine the world we want. And I'll start by just giving you an overview of the basic dimensions of social ecology, talk about some of the movements that it's influenced over the decades, and then talk about what that means here in Vermont. And this image is from near where I live, facing the Worcester Mountains. And when I try to offer an overview of social ecology, I generally frame it in terms of these 5 levels of understanding, which over time have evolved, each building on the other. And I'll just say them briefly and then give you a little more detail on each one. It starts with an ecological critique of politics as usual, goes on to a study of anthropology and history to try to help us understand the roots of humanity's what sometimes seems like growing separation from the rest of nature. There's a philosophical outlook that looks at the evolution of human consciousness and how we might realize human potentialities in the broadest sense. There's a political strategy rooted in the imperative of decentralization and the potential for direct democracy, a political strategy that came to be known as communalism. And finally, a long-range vision that's about how we can restore a sense of harmony between our communities and the natural world, and rooting that in a whole set of practical, hands-on experiments that show us how we can live differently. A lot of this framework, a lot of this framework, oh good. A lot of this framework was developed by a teacher of mine who lived in Burlington for the last 25 years of his life, named Murray Bookchin, who at least a couple of people here knew well. Murray got his start as a teenager in the labor movement of the 1930s, militant time in the US. And through decades of depression and war and reaction, he came to see the limitations of what we now think of as the old left of the 1930s. He saw rising environmental problems that became increasingly unavoidable as the 1950s evolved into the 60s. The increasing co-optation and decline of what was once a strong labor left. And that led Murray to a whole host of pivotal questions. First, coming to appreciate the role of community rather than the workplace as a central site of political struggle. Coming to understand, of course, the nature of the ecological crisis, which he viewed as potentially the greatest challenge to capitalism as we know it. And from his roots in the old left, evolved a deep rethinking of a whole set of political ideas and philosophies and strategies that people on the left had come to take for granted for many generations. And on the table, I've got two sets of books. On the left are some basic texts in social ecology that you can browse. On the right, there are several books of mine that are available for sale. I've been writing on these ideas and issues since I was in my 30s. I turned 70 this year. I've been part of many of the movements that social ecology has evolved, has influenced rather, over the decades. So back to the basic framework. I'm going to need this to keep track of the time. Oh, but there's a clock. I saw a clock. Oh, it's right there. Perfect. Much better. So it starts with, as I mentioned, a sharp critique of politics as usual. And the primary focus of that critique is the understanding that the environmental problems we face are fundamentally social and political in nature. Bookchin and other social ecologists tend to be very critical of what we think of often as the technical fix approach to environmental problems, that if we can come up with the right set of technologies or policy solutions that problems can be solved. He and the rest of us came to see environmental problems as fundamentally rooted in the nature of the social system that we live under, rooted in the growth dynamics of capitalism, but even more fundamentally in the evolution of patterns of social domination and hierarchy going way, way back in human history. This critique frames both ecological science and a broader ecological sensibility as a fundamental challenge to politics as usual. So that's the first step. This led Bookchin back in the 1960s and 70s to many years of intensive research in the most leading edge anthropological research of the time, as well as studies of the long scope of human history. And Murray came to the conclusion that the notion of humans dominating nature, which is so ingrained in the mainstream culture on so many levels, is fundamentally mythical. It's impossible to dominate the natural world. And that this myth of domination is historically a product of the emergence of hierarchical social relationships at various stages of human history. Looking at the anthropological literature of his era, Bookchin sought to tease out what are the principles that earlier human societies and even contemporary indigenous cultures were founded upon that offer us guideposts to help us see how we can get past these patterns of hierarchy and domination. Principles like the ways that many human cultures, especially in early history, but also we know there continue to be many thriving in the present, thrived with an intense sense of interdependence and intimacy and reciprocity between human communities and the rest of nature, a notion of unity in diversity. Diversity has become controversial in current politics, but we know that it's a core ecological as well as social principle, that the integrity of a natural ecosystem and the integrity of a community often depend on the strength of and diversity of relationships among its various elements. In economics, many human societies throughout history and prehistory have reflected principles like what the anthropologist Paul Radin called the community as responsible for providing that to everyone. Murray looked intensively at especially Western history and tried to understand the historical tensions between tendencies toward domination that evolved at various times and places and tendencies toward fuller expressions of freedom. He also repeatedly emphasized, we don't need that at the moment, he repeatedly emphasized that looking at these principles that emerge from our understanding of prehistory isn't carried out for the purpose of being nostalgic, of looking back on a lost past to try to recreate it, but rather to understand what principles have driven human societies in many different times and places that give us a sense of possibility, that give us a sense of values that we can once again reach toward. And the core conclusion of that book, The Ecology of Freedom, is that if we can find ways to bring together some of those very ancient social principles with more modern notions of autonomy, of universalism, that we can achieve a much higher level, potentially, of human freedom than we've maybe ever seen before. So moving toward potentially higher levels of human freedom as a fundamental goal. The third element, you'll remember from the chart, was the philosophical one, and there's a lot to be said about there's actually a book called The Philosophy of Social Ecology, which I didn't bring here, but has been reprinted and is available. That goes into great depth on the underlying philosophy, which looks at things like the emergence of human consciousness through natural evolution, looks at phases of social evolution, looking back to some very ancient notions of non-human nature as a first nature, of social structures that have evolved throughout human history as a kind of second nature. Then these are notions, again, going back to ancient times. But what Murray posited was the potential for a dialectical transcendence, the emergence of a free nature that transcends those divisions, that looks to the creativity in natural evolution and the potential, as I said earlier, for a deeper sense of harmony. He believed that natural evolution tends toward abundance, toward increasing complexity, even though we know there are waves of creation and destruction, of course, throughout natural evolution. A tendency toward optimizing creativity, toward innovation, that he viewed human reason as a logical outcome of. Bookchin's nature philosophy questions the whole notion of nature as a realm of necessity, which is taken for granted in so much of Western thought, and saw it as a basis for helping us actualize the potential for a deeper sense of creativity and freedom. The next stage that I mention is the political strategy, which in many ways was, for Bookchin and a lot of us, a direct outgrowth of these deeper inquiries. It's a political strategy that came to be known as communalism, honoring the political tradition of the Paris Commune. 150th anniversary of those events were celebrated throughout Europe just a few years ago. It's a politics of decentralism and direct democracy, as I said, and also of developing strategies to reclaim the decisions that affect our lives, as I said at the outset. The institution, the human and social institution that Bookchin most looked to was the town meeting, the popular assembly, the ways in which these kinds of forms have emerged at various times and places throughout human history. And my friend Eleanor Finley's brand new book, Practicing Social Ecology, goes into some of the very recent literature on popular assemblies as a social form and how it's emerged in many times and places based on her field research and also a lot of historical study. The idea that we can empower our towns and neighbors, directly challenge imposed forms of power and authority, and transcend some of the forms of parochialism that we all know can sometimes emerge when our focus is a little too narrowly local. And then finally, in the political realm, he posited the notion of a moral economy governed by communities as an alternative to the tyranny imposed by the market system. The last dimension in the original chart is the long-range reconstructive vision of social ecology, again, one of ecology, communities reharmonizing with the natural world, what my friend Dan Chodorkov, the founder of the Institute for Social Ecology, along with Murray, calls practical utopianism, finding ways that we practice how we want the world to be in our daily lives. The Institute from the beginning has encouraged work in areas like permaculture, greening of cities, green building, many other hands-on methods that help show how we can live differently. And in a recent article that you can find in this past summer's issue of the journal New Politics, I discovered that there's a whole new literature of so-called post-apocalypse, knowing that we're no longer in a place where it's very likely that we're going to prevent some of the consequences of climate change and other environmental catastrophes that are upon us. And it turns out there are people all around the world who, in response to this understanding of the kind of apocalyptic world that we're living in, rather than retreating, rather than throwing up their hands and saying, you know, collapse is here, there's nothing we can do about it, are redoubling their commitments to mutual aid, to community empowerment, to finding ways to continue to thrive, and hopefully ultimately take us to the post-fossil fuel world that we know is necessary if the rest of life on Earth is going to continue to thrive. Now, the next thing I want to do, which is going to require the slides, is show you some of the movements over the decades that have been influenced by social ecology. And then I'll talk a little bit more about what it has meant and can mean here in Vermont. So I'm going to try once again to get this thing working. There's no flat surface here. Okay, here we go. All right, it's working. I think I'm going to have to switch the chair over to the other side in order to be able to go through these slides, which will go a lot quicker. So, of course, social ecology emerged in many respects during the height of the 1960s environmental movement, and I wrote a book back in the late 90s, which is on the table, that looked at the evolution of different tendencies in that movement, some of the tensions between more mainstream, conventionally policy-oriented approaches and some of the alternative approaches that emerged in the 1980s and 90s. But probably the first movement that really, okay, now how do I, it's not letting me advance my slides. It's not letting me do anything.
Second order resistance from the...
It worked before. Famous last words. Oh, there we go. Can scroll. So one of the first, that's way too small. One of the first movements that really embraced some of the influences from social ecology was the anti-nuclear movement of the late 1970s and early 80s. I'm sure many of you were involved in one way or another in campaigns against nuclear plants in Seabrook, New Hampshire, Vermont Yankee, etc. And that was a movement that embraced a politics of direct action and direct democracy. People were organized into small groups called affinity groups, which is actually a term that Murray Bookchin, in his research on the anarchist movement prior to the Spanish Civil War, traced its origins to that movement in Spain, the idea of the grupos de afinidad in Spain, that were the core structure of the organization for much of its existence. And of course, there were tensions eventually that undermined that. But the Clamshell Alliance, exactly. And I should mention that some of us recently who were active in those days have been working to create a modern website in the name of the Clamshell Alliance for the first time, and setting it up as a source of current news on how to stop this renewed push for nuclear power that we're seeing on the part of the tech billionaires and folks in the energy industry. But this was a movement that tried to embody, again, its visions of a better world in how it was organized. It embraced a variety of what were then seen as alternative, I skipped one, of alternative technologies. And this is Kate Farm in Plainfield back in the 70s, where the Institute for Social Ecology was founded. It was part of Goddard College in those days, and it was one of the first demonstration sites for renewable energy, and one of the only places back then where people could come and study solar and wind energy, greenhouses, organic growing methods, permaculture, etc. This is really where the Institute had its founding, it spent its founding years. And the reconstructive dimension of the anti-nuclear movement was the early renewable technology movement, which really did have, in many ways, the character of a movement that thrived in parallel to the anti-nuclear movement of the time. Social ecologists were involved in, let's see if I can get it to do one at a time. It keeps wanting to do two. It works much better with the arrows. Oh, now the arrows are working. How about that? But it's shrinking everything. Social ecologists, were active in elevating links between ecology and feminism, and put forward through the works of people like Inestra King, a dialectical understanding of how women's consciousness, and today we would of course add the consciousness of people who are non-binary, are shaped by forms of oppression and by Western notions of a historical association with nature that is often framed in very reactionary, biologically determinist ways, but then transcending those limitations toward developing a worldview that's potentially liberatory for everyone. Social ecologists were active in the early years of green politics in the US. This was the first national conference of the US Greens. Before, it was primarily about running candidates for president, and really envisioned itself as a network of local activists that sometimes engaged in local electoral work, but it was really rooted in a vision of a movement of movements, increasingly undermined by folks in the Greens who wanted to do conventionally statist politics. In response to that, people involved in social ecology started something called the Left Green Network and an organization called the Youth Greens, which came together back on the 20th anniversary of the original Earth Day in April of 1990 for what became the first nonviolent attempt to shut down Wall Street post the 1960s. And that's an action that brought thousands of people to the streets of around Wall Street to try to make the case, as you see, that we're not all equally to blame for destroying the Earth. 1990 was the year that Earth Day came to be all about corporations taking full-page ads in the press saying we're all responsible and we're all doing our part to make it better. And of course that wasn't true then, it's not true now, and our idea was to go to the source and take it to Wall Street. Juan Gonzalez, who folks know as the co-host of Democracy Now!, was then a correspondent for the New York Daily News and wrote a column which was the only thing in the mainstream press that actually conveyed the message of what this action was about. And in those days, the Daily News had a lot more readers than the Times. Skipping ahead several years, the actions in Seattle against the World Trade Organization spawned a whole renewal of the kind of decentralist affinity group-based politics that first crystallized in the anti-nuclear movement. And people from the Institute went to Seattle, and several people in our immediate circle spent several months laying the groundwork for what turned out to be an incredibly successful, despite intense police repression, effort to prevent the World Trade Organization from crystallizing its power as an overarching global governing instrument in the name of empowering corporations over people. A few months later, in Washington, D.C., a similar action in response to the annual meetings of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. Folks might remember how intense the focus was during those years on these international financial institutions and the nefarious roles that many of them were playing. Some years later, we worked with environmental justice activists like these folks in Richmond, California, who'd been fighting a big Richmond refinery for many years, to begin to articulate a politics of climate justice. And that's something I've written extensively about over the last 15 years or so. Climate justice brings together movements of indigenous and other land-based peoples from around the world, people from environmental justice communities, mostly communities of color in the US that are at the receiving end of a lot of the worst pollution, and also some of the more explicitly political elements that came out of the Seattle era global justice movement, determined to really focus on the systemic roots of environmental problems, expose various false solutions like nuclear power to the climate crisis, and again, try to embody in the work that we do in the world our visions of a genuinely liberated society. Here in Vermont, during those years, we were very focused on issues around biotechnology and GMOs. One of the first big events we did was in Boston, where we staged a huge demonstration and march against the annual convention of the biotechnology industry at the old Boston Convention Center when it was right near the Prudential. This was the delegation from the National Family Farm Coalition that participated in that event. Folks might recognize Will Allen from a farm here in Thetford, who was part of that group. Bread and Puppet came with 3 busloads of props for that march. It was quite a happening. Years later, the biotech convention came back to Boston, and we did an event in solidarity with folks in the south end of Boston who were fighting a bioweapons lab that was in the process of being proposed for the neighborhood around Boston University Medical School. And you might recognize some well-known Bread and Puppet folks in this particular crowd. Here in Vermont, we spent a lot of that same time working intensively in our towns to raise the issue of genetic engineering. This is when GMO crops were first beginning to be grown, and it was an issue that there was not that much awareness of yet, and we came to use our town meetings as a vehicle for raising these issues. And over the course of about 4 or 5 years, it's not that easy to see the map on this screen, but 85 towns all over Vermont, mostly, really scattered in different regions. Jericho, which is here, unfortunately, was not one of the towns that passed a resolution against GMOs. Underhill was. Underhill and Westford and Fletcher in this general area. But places around Burlington and central Vermont and the Upper Valley, a few in the Kingdom, scattered around, and in the southeast were involved in this campaign. And I'll say a little bit more about the politics of how that played out after I'm done with the slides. But just 2 more really quickly. Occupy Wall Street is a movement that social ecologists were very active in. Of course, the Popular Assembly on a huge scale was one of the main and best known and most powerful expressions of that movement. And Occupy Wall Street wasn't, of course, an isolated event. It had its roots in the Arab Spring at the beginning of 2011. It had roots in occupations of town squares all over Europe that happened over the course of the previous spring and summer, culminating in Occupy Wall Street, and then eventually scores of other Occupies, including one in Burlington, local groups inspired by Occupy in Montpelier and Newport and many places in Vermont to further the ideas around the prevalence of inequality in this economy, the role of the wealthiest 1%, and it's even more realistic to focus on the wealthiest 10th or even 100% whose political power has become even more overwhelming in recent years, but really first raising those issues in a public way. And then the last movement that I'll mention briefly is the Kurdish freedom movement, that through its politics of what it calls democratic confederalism has, from both a strong feminist point of view, this is a women's assembly in a Kurdish town in northern Syria, but also in its politics, drawing explicitly on some of the ideas about direct democracy and organizing from below and what it means to do that in practice. That comes from the writings of Murray Bookchin and other social ecologists. And really the Kurdish movement in the 2010s was what brought an awareness of social ecology to a whole new generation of activists around the world. Next week I'm going to be on a panel for a class at a university in British Columbia with Debbie Bookchin, Murray's daughter, who's been traveling around the world talking both about social ecology but also very specifically about her work with the Kurdish freedom movement. So those are some of the movements that social ecology has influenced over the years. And I want to conclude by just saying a little bit about the challenges here and the limitations of some of what we've been involved with here in Vermont. I think it helps to start with some history, which is that in Vermont and across New England, the era leading up to the American Revolution was one of increasing democratization, expansion of the franchise. Murray wrote about that in the first volume of his 4-volume history of revolutions called The Third Revolution. Highly recommend his account of the American Revolution as well as the English and French and others subsequent to that. It turns out that once the U.S. became established, Vermont towns were continued to be active in using town meetings to debate a whole host of issues, relations with England and France, the War of 1812, opposition to slavery, and especially its westward expansion, which of course was a heated political and legal battle throughout the 1830s to 50s. Vermont town meetings organized in opposition to the Mexican War in 1848. But then there was about 100-year plus gap where the focus of town meetings here in Vermont became increasingly narrow, increasingly focused only on the most immediate day-to-day and year-to-year concerns. And an idea emerged and became popularized by academics like Frank Bryan, whose work I'm sure many people are familiar with, that issues beyond the immediate concerns of the town are just not germane to town meeting discussions. That began to change in the 1970s when a few Vermont towns passed resolutions to impeach Nixon. But it really came to the fore, as I'm sure many of you remember, in the nuclear freeze movement in the early 80s, where over the course of 3 years, 150 towns in Vermont came out for a freeze on nuclear weapons, and that really galvanized the anti-nuclear weapons movement all across the country and played a significant role in pushing Ronald Reagan, who of course was completely hostile to the idea at the outset, to negotiate further limitations on nuclear weapons with the Soviets. In the ensuing years, we had town meeting campaigns on a host of issues: acid rain, nuclear power, the Iraq War. And then, as I mentioned earlier, between 2001 and 5, 85 towns passed resolutions around GMOs here in Vermont. Over 120 towns, New England-wide, were involved in that campaign. A few towns in Maine, and also on the West Coast, 3 whole counties in California actually banned the growing of GMOs during that period. But here in Vermont, we found that we ran up against some serious limitations. We had organizations like the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, which was then supported by the Attorney General's office, telling town select boards that they could refuse petitions from citizens even if they met the threshold for getting on the ballot. We learned that there were serious limitations on what towns could actually do. Eventually, this campaign, which was a huge educational effort because people in every one of those 85 towns had to become familiar enough with the issues to be able to present an item and argue for it at their town meeting. It did a lot to raise consciousness around the issues. It spawned a legislative effort that led to a seed labeling law in 2004, GMO liability law that almost passed in 2006. It might have even passed and been vetoed by Governor Douglas. I'm not remembering now exactly which it was. Another food labeling law that passed in the 2010s. But the focus of our work, as you saw from the slides, was on the bigger issues, not just on food labeling, but on the implications for farmers, on the international implications, and the fundamental threat of GMO growing to biodiversity and also agrobiodiversity. And we ran up against the limitations around what towns can actually do. It turns out some of that has a very specific legal basis. We learned that in current Vermont law, towns actually don't have home rule, and if a town decides to even change its charter or its tax rates in any significant way, you probably know, it has to then go to the legislature to vote on it. And this goes back to actually an 1868 Iowa court decision arguing that towns are fundamentally creatures of the state rather than autonomous entities with the ability to make our own rules. The two or three towns in Maine that were able to ban GMOs were able to take advantage of the fact that Maine considers itself to be a home rule state where this so-called Dillon's rule does not apply. But here in Vermont, we don't have that advantage. So what to do about it? Beyond education, the educational and organizing potential of town meetings, what can we do to take this further? Murray Bookchin believed that the experience of direct democracy and community empowerment was inherently politicizing, was inherently potentially revolutionary in the sense that people who felt empowered to make basic decisions about their lives were less likely to fall into the patterns of provincialism and reaction that we see in so much of the country. Yet we know there are also some incredibly reactionary localist movements to ban library books and change curricula and especially those kinds of issues. How can the potential for a different kind of politics emerge from our own town meetings here in Vermont? We tried to come up with measures that towns could take to limit growing of GMOs, and we were ready to, with political and legal strategies to help towns strategize around that. But ultimately, most people who were involved in that campaign preferred to go the safer route of trying to appeal to the legislature. And of course, we ran very much up against the limitations of those kinds of strategies. How can we get beyond that? How can we develop models of confederation that enable towns to take more challenging measures? There have been some successes. I remember years ago a meeting out in Wells River where people from all over central Vermont came together to tell the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that we didn't want nuclear waste in the mountains of central Vermont, and they left and never came back. But those victories are rare. What can we do to not just scale up our efforts, but as the radical anthropologist Arturo Escobar argues, to create models of horizontalism, of equal power and equal relationship in our communities that can radiate outward across the country and across the globe. These are all open questions, and we're at a time when there are a lot more questions than answers. We know that, as I said at the outset, that it's difficult to be trying to sustain these broader visions of a better world in such dystopian times. But we know that throughout history, people have successfully overturned all kinds of authoritarian regimes. And we know that history itself is always full of surprises. So I'm going to end on that note and then open it up for questions and discussion after I get some water. Thank you, everybody.
Whoever talks, I'm just gonna, any questions or comments anybody has, just use this.
So what's everybody think? Yes, Brian.
Are people working on models of social ecology in terms of communities? And are there models to follow? I mean, the localism of food is one kind of way that communities can center around and take control of essentials to their survival. But are there models that are model communities that aside of what's your group?
The food hub, or the transition town.
Transition town, yeah. Like in England, they had some communities that have successfully worked on developing models. Does transition town have that going here? And are there models in Vermont or nation to look to other communities around?
Well, I'll point you to this book, which just came out this year, from Eleanor Finley, who lives down in Washington, D.C., who's been working with us since the Occupy Wall Street days. And she just finished her PhD in anthropology through UMass and spent several years leading up to the pandemic, when her research got cut short, looking for communities doing that. And she spent a fair amount of time not in the liberated Kurdish zone of northern Syria that's depicted in the photo, but in the Kurdish regions of southern Turkey, where these ideas are very much alive. She spent time in Barcelona, where people with a similar political outlook got elected to office, and through an organization called Barcelona en Comú, instituted a lot of important changes in the city by organizing from below and eventually working from City Hall. She looks at the permaculture movement in Western Mass and some of the ways that model is spreading. And we know here in Vermont that there are so many locally based efforts that are contributing to making the world better. And then since the pandemic, the rise of mutual aid movements and organizations in many different settings. I was at a meeting in New York a few years ago. I think it was maybe one of the first in-person events I went to after the pandemic, and there was some people there from an organization called Mutual Aid Disaster Relief that had actually figured out ways to reconfigure whole supply chains so that goods that would normally have been trapped by the bottlenecks that existed during the pandemic were able to be freed up and distributed to people who needed it.
Yeah, it's not during COVID.
Yeah.
food organizations to make sure people have something to eat.
Yeah. Laura mentioned the food hub model, which has existed here in Vermont for easily 10 years. And at one point in the 20 teens, when I was teaching on food movements at UVM, it seemed like they were popping up all over the state, but I know there are still a few, and these are about community-based ways that food from local farms can be made directly available to people in towns rather than relying on conventional distribution systems. Community control of renewable energy is an effort that people have attempted in various settings, in various places. There's a whole worldwide energy democracy movement focused on that theme. There are only a few relatively small examples of that here in Vermont, but I know there was a time when, maybe 10 or so years ago, when a majority of the wind power in Minnesota was locally owned.
Well, the town-owned dams.
The town-owned dams are definitely an example.
Last year, the legislature passed a law that allows entities besides municipalities to form energy companies in terms of geothermal.
That's right.
It's a way to
Yeah, and we know that geothermal energy works much better on a community scale than an individual scale. And I know some of the people who are working on trying to implement that. It's been slow because, any energy project takes a fair amount of capital to get off the ground, and there's a shortage of that.
and bureaucratic tape.
Bureaucratic red tape, yeah. And bureaucratic red tape has been the main obstacle to even small town scale solar installations owned by the towns.
Not to mention the governor.
Yes. Not to mention the governor.
I can address the food hub a little bit. Transition Town has been around maybe since 2016 and have always had a small organizing body, but once we helped sprout the food hub, the organizing body is maybe 15 to 20 people. Food affects everyone. It's a great way to energize if there are people here from other towns. It's been a great way to get much more involvement. We all have to eat. And we've made our farmers, our local, really brought them to the fore. Who are they? What are their needs? How they're often exporting their food. They want to feed the locals more, and the food hub is trying to work on making those connections happen. And there are a couple of us here involved in and the other thing is we've combined with Underhill. So it's been a great way to compound the towns in their activism. And I'm peripherally involved in that, so afterwards I can answer any questions. But it really, and we have a model in Hardwick, some models in southern Vermont, not having to reinvent the wheel. The food hubs are definitely happening in Vermont. Any other questions or comments?
I guess I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about, nuclear energy. And I guess what the current thinking, sort of like opposition to it, might be. Is it like, is often implemented by corporations and waste concerns. But I've also read about the technology has changed a lot since the original nuclear movement, and there's research underway to, I guess there's reactors in China that are being built that can't melt down, and in the United States we're looking at small modular reactors, but those still haven't been actually implemented yet. And I guess one of the other concerns is being able to deploy renewable energy quickly enough that we can shift away from fossil fuels in a timely manner. I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, as somebody who's followed developments in the nuclear industry for almost 50 years, I can say that the claims that are being made now that current nuclear power can be better, cheaper, safer, etc., these are claims we've heard repeatedly over the last 40 years since the earlier phase of nuclear development in this country ended after the 3 Mile Island meltdown. And personally, I don't think these claims are any more credible now than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Nuclear power is the most expensive, most inefficient, slowest to build, and most dangerous energy technology there is. The only nuclear plants that have been built and opened in the US in the last 30 years, I think it is a pair of plants in Georgia that just opened earlier this year. It took 2 or 3 times longer to build it at something like 3 times the cost of what was originally projected. And in that amount of time, with that amount of capital, we could build enough solar and wind energy with battery backup to deal with the intermittency problem, and also networked systems contribute to dealing with the intermittency problem, as they've found in many countries in Europe that have much higher percentages of renewable energy than we have here, and began to do that even before modern battery technology, just taking advantage of the interlinks among systems in different geographies to deal with the intermittency problem. And the technology for that is all software. China, as you said, seems to be building nuclear plants faster and cheaper than anywhere else in the world. And it seems like they're able to do it partly because the regulations that exist are much less transparent, partly because they seem to have unlimited capital, so they can just keep throwing money at problems until they appear to have solved them. But right now, if I remember correctly, and I read a few things on this just recently, even though China is building nuclear plants, they're building a lot more solar and wind facilities because they can be brought online that much quicker and are that much more economically efficient. I think China is pushing for nuclear power more for geopolitical reasons than for energy reasons. For many years, France was held up as an example of nuclear power being more viable, but in France, the nuclear industry is essentially part of the military, as I think it probably also is in China. And when they tried to export the French model of nuclear development in recent years in Finland, that plant also cost 4 or 5 times more than its initial projected cost and took 2 or 3 times longer to build. Small modular reactors that are in the news a lot these days exist really only on paper. There has yet to be a single successful example of one built anywhere. And the data I've seen suggests that the cost per unit of energy is even higher than for conventional nuclear reactors. So now they're saying, well, we don't want to just build one modular reactor in a given location. We want to build 10 of them. And 10 small reactors is as much of a problem, especially in terms of the nuclear waste output, as one large one, and the cost per unit energy is even that much higher. There's a nuclear whistleblower that used to live in Burlington and is now somewhere in Florida, named Arnie Gunderson, and he calls small modular reactors PowerPoint reactors, because PowerPoint slides are the only places they exist.
Don't they exist on nuclear submarines?
There are small reactors on nuclear submarines, but it's a whole different technology, and
Staggeringly expensive.
they're yeah.
It seems like eventually they contaminate the whole boat.
I would imagine they probably do. Yeah.
How does social ecology respond to this era of mistrust in science, or what can it offer us?
That's an interesting question. I think as social ecologists, we tend to be very pro-science, but also appreciate that science can be corrupted by corporate influences. And there's a real difference between objective, independent science and what I typically call corporate science. Unfortunately, the COVID skeptics tended to get it all mixed up. And
I don't
tended
mean
to-
corporate science, I mean like basic.
Yeah, and
basic
what
science.
they did over the course of the pandemic and the years immediately after was, encourage people to be skeptical of all science. And I think
But it was happening before that.
It was.
With climate change and anti-vaccine movements, and so there's it's just increasing. Those are two glaring examples of our time.
mhm.
So maybe what can it offer a perspective on that? Those are two really big problems. Either it's going to result in outbreaks, and it's going to result in flooding and really damage to humanity and the environment in the latter example. So maybe just getting specific about those two examples. Those aren't really, corporations have their role in those, but I think there's some mistrust in vaccine and climate science among everyday people.
Yeah, I think one thing that social ecology gives us in trying to, I'm just kind of figuring this out as we go, to help us deal with those kinds of problems is it encourages us to get to the source of the problem. And to get to the source of the problem in this case means trying to understand where that misinformation comes from, whose interests it serves, and also it means we have to challenge the whole, the profound distrust of reason and thought, the anti-intellectualism that serves the most reactionary elements in the country. Murray Bookchin was extremely irate around the anti-intellectualism that's so pervasive in US culture. And I think we have to get to the root of that if we're going to cut through the misinformation around specific issues. I think a lot of experienced science teachers have a much more articulate agenda for how to do that than I do. But I think we have to get to the roots of American anti-intellectualism and how the right milks people's fears for political gain. And that's probably a more general answer than what you're looking for, but I think it's a starting point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know there's no easy.
Yeah, I have friends who are, generally very sensible about most things, who fell into the vaccine skeptic camp during the pandemic and still haven't gotten over it. And it's really troubling. Yes?
I have a question around, it sounds like for social ecology, it's sort of trying to move past labor unions, or maybe not necessarily past it, but it saw some possible issues Murray Bookchin did when he was working for the labor unions, and kind of pivoted more towards working on like the municipal level in our local towns, people who live here, trying to give people who live in an area more control over what goes on. I wonder if you've come up with, or what's your experience in maybe revisiting like the economic sphere of how decisions are made? I know there's groups like Cooperation Jackson and Cooperation Vermont, which are trying to actually purchase businesses, collect interest payments, put them into like a cooperatively funded bank to fund more cooperative projects. So more in the economic sphere than maybe just only the municipal level, but certainly intertwined to kind of, I'm curious if you guys explored that avenue over the years and kind of, if you've heard of Cooperation Vermont and Cooperation Jackson, sort of your thoughts on those movements.
Yes, I'm a big fan of both.
Nice.
Kali Akuno, one of the founders of Cooperation Jackson, actually hosts a YouTube interview series where he interviews activists from throughout the global South. That's on the Institute's YouTube channel. We work very closely with Cooperation Vermont in Marshfield. We did a big event a few summers ago that was co-sponsored by all three entities, including the ISE. And I think developing worker co-ops as an alternative to business as usual is a crucially important strategy. I think strengthening unions in this day and age is also a crucially important strategy. You know, Bookchin was responding to the intense co-optation of the trade union movement, mostly during the McCarthy era, the last Red Scare. We're in the next Red Scare now. And at that time, it seemed like they had been corrupted to the point where they weren't really able to be the force for progressive change that they had historically been. But now we see how the loss of union membership and union involvement, especially in rural areas of the country, is contributing to the rise of this reactionary movement. You know, a lot of areas of the U.S. that are both rural and industrialized maintained a progressive political character for most of the 20th century, largely because unions were so active and visible, and we see the consequences of losing that. And I think the current wave of union militancy, whether it's Chicago teachers or Amazon workers or any of the other examples that are happening now, are incredibly important. And the strategy of building worker co-ops as an alternative to business as usual is also incredibly important.
Yeah, definitely. Seems like there's a lot. We want to have horizontalism in our towns, and we also do need it in our workplaces to a degree, and we have a lot of issues like hospitals closing. Like, how can we fund things that take care of our people so we can create a better world, you know? Yeah, thanks for your answer.
Absolutely. Thanks. Well, we're approaching 7:30, but I'm happy to have more conversation if other people have other thoughts about any of what we've been talking about this evening.
We have no, you're there.
You mentioned the phrase moral economy, and I'm wondering if that had a meaning other than just economy.
Well, it's a moral economy is a phrase that's meant different things at different times in history. There's a famous essay by the historian E.P. Thompson on the moral economy of bread riots in London during the early Industrial Revolution, when people, when the power of early industrialists was so overwhelming that people in London and other major cities in Europe were starving. And the people created their own food economy in defiance of the market. There's an essay called Market Economy or Moral Economy that's in a book of Murray's called The Modern Crisis that came out in the mid-'80s. And that was actually based on a talk he gave to the big summer conference of NOFA, in one of their first big regional conferences in the early 80s, when NOFA was mostly based here and in New Hampshire. And the conference shifted back and forth, and that year, I think it was up at Johnson State, and Murray gave a talk on the potential for the organic movement to be the harbinger of a much broader rethinking of the economy, and the idea that economic cooperatives of various kinds and local food systems and local energy systems and all the things that we've been talking about have the potential to free us of the kinds of dependencies that corporations take advantage of, and allow us to live better in our communities than we do now, and waste less money on feeding the profit system. And he also emphasized that economic alternatives are fundamentally educational projects. They're about helping us think, helping us learn how to think differently about our whole spectrum of economic and political relationships.
Crises tend to spawn those kind of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Last question, anyone? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.